Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I used to be a park ranger in West Virginia, working the night shifts around Blackwater Falls State Park. 23 years on the job, and I've seen things that still make me check my locks twice before bed. But nothing prepared me for what happened during the summer of 2019. It started with a missing persons report. 3 college kids from Virginia Tech had gone camping in the backcountry, way off the marked trails. Their names were Jake Morrison, Sarah Chen, and Tommy Rodriguez. Good kids, according to their families. Experienced hikers who knew what they were doing. They were supposed to check in with Sarah's mom every other day. When she didn't hear from them for 4 days straight, she called us. We organized a search party immediately. The Appalachian wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes, and every hour counts when someone goes missing. We found their campsite on the 3rd day of searching. It was about 8 miles from the nearest trail, tucked into a valley that most people never see. Everything was still there. Tents perfectly set up, sleeping bags laid out, food hanging properly from a bare line. Even their phones were charging from a portable battery pack. But here's what made my skin crawl. Their boots were lined up perfectly outside the main tent. All 6 boots arranged in a neat row like they were planning to come right back. The fire pit had cold ashes, but there were 3 logs arranged in a perfect triangle on top. Not how anyone builds a fire. Not how anyone leaves a fire. My partner, Dave, found something else. About 50 yards from the camp, there were footprints in the soft earth near a creek. Bare feet. 3 sets walking in single file toward the deeper woods. The prints were clear, like they'd been pressed into wet clay. But here's the thing that still haunts me. The footprints were too perfect. No stumbling, no variation in depth. Like 3 people walking in a trance. We followed those prints for 2 miles. They led us up a steep ridge, through brambles that should have torn bare feet to shreds. But there was no blood, no sign of struggle. The prints just kept going, steady and purposeful, until they reached a clearing at the top of the ridge. In that clearing, we found something that made us call the state police immediately. Carved into the largest oak tree were symbols, not random scratches, deliberate symbols that looked ancient. Below the tree was a circle of stones, each one about the size of a basketball, arranged in perfect symmetry. And in the center of that circle were 3 piles of clothes, neatly folded. Jake's flannel shirt, Sarah's hiking pants, Tommy's baseball cap, everything they'd been wearing, according to the photos their families had given us. The state investigators took over from there. They brought in specialists, cadaver dogs, even a helicopter with thermal imaging. We searched for 2 more weeks. Nothing, no bodies, no trace, no explanation for how 3 people could just vanish into thin air. But I kept going back to that clearing on my own time. Something about those symbols bothered me. I took pictures and showed them to my grandfather, who'd lived in these mountains his whole life. His face went white when he saw them. "That's old mountain magic," he whispered. "The kind the Cherokee warned about before they were forced out. There are things in these hills that were here long before any of us." He told me stories I'd never heard before, about families who'd settled too deep in the mountains and changed, about sounds that would call to people in the night, leading them away from safety, about clearings where the rules of the world worked differently. I tried to dismiss it as old superstition. But then I started noticing things during my night patrols. Lights moving through the forest where no trails existed. The sound of voices singing in harmony, but in no language I recognized. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I'd hear 3 people laughing together somewhere in the distance. The official report listed Jake, Sarah, and Tommy as missing persons, presumed dead due to exposure. Their families held memorial services. The case was quietly closed after 6 months, but I know they're still out there. Not dead, but not alive in any way we'd understand. Because last month I was doing a routine patrol near that clearing, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. 3 voices, calling my name from deep in the woods. Jake's voice, Sarah's voice, Tommy's voice. All of them sounding exactly like they did in the interviews their families gave to the news stations. "Come join us," they called. "It's beautiful here. It's peaceful. You don't have to be afraid anymore." I ran back to my truck and didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. But as I was pulling away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw 3 figures standing at the edge of the tree line. They were too far away to make out clearly, but I could see they were waving. I put in my resignation the next morning. Told my supervisor I was taking early retirement. He didn't ask questions, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Maybe I had, or maybe I'd seen something worse. Something that takes people and makes them into something else. Something that's been living in these mountains since long before we ever arrived. I still live in West Virginia, but I stay in town now. And when I hear those voices calling my name in my dreams, I make sure all my windows are locked tight. My name is Marcus, and I drive long-haul trucks across the eastern seaboard. Been doing it for 15 years, and I know every truck stop, every gas station, every rest area from Maine to Georgia. I know which places are safe to sleep and which ones you drive past without stopping. But there's one place I can't explain. A place that shouldn't exist, but somehow keeps showing up when I'm driving through the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. It happened for the first time 3 years ago. I was hauling electronics from Cincinnati to Charlotte, running behind schedule because of traffic in Louisville. It was past midnight, and I was getting into that dangerous territory where your eyelids start feeling heavy. The mountain roads through Kentucky are no place to fall asleep at the wheel. I was looking for a place to pull over when I saw the glow of neon lights ahead. A gas station appeared around the curve, sitting by itself in a small valley between 2 ridges. The sign read, "Mountain View Service," in flickering blue letters. It looked like it had been there since the 1960s, the kind of place with full-service pumps and a mechanic's bay. I pulled in, grateful to find somewhere open. The parking lot was empty except for an old pickup truck parked near the building. As I climbed down from my cab, I noticed how quiet everything was. No highway noise, no insects, no wind. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights above the pumps. The attendant who came out was an elderly man with deep-set eyes and calloused hands. He moved slowly, like he had all the time in the world. When he spoke, his voice had that thick mountain accent that sounds like it comes from another century. "Fill her up?" he asked, not really looking at me. I nodded and handed him my company credit card. While he pumped the diesel, I went inside to grab some coffee and use the restroom. The store was exactly what you'd expect from a place like that. Dusty shelves, outdated snacks, a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. But there were things that seemed off. The magazines on the rack were all from 2003. The prices on everything were way too low. Candy bars for 50 cents, coffee for a quarter, and there was a smell in the air, like old wood and something else I couldn't identify. The man behind the counter was different from the pump attendant. Younger, maybe in his 40s, but with the same deep-set eyes. He watched me the entire time I was in the store, never blinking, never moving. When I brought my coffee to the counter, he just stared at me. "You're not from around here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Just passing through," I replied, "heading south on 119. He tilted his head like he was confused. 119? Ain't no 1 through here. You must be thinking of Route 23. I knew I was on 119. I'd been driving these roads for years, but I didn't want to argue with the locals, so I just paid for my coffee and headed back to my truck. The pump attendant was finishing up with the diesel. When I asked for a receipt, he handed me a slip of paper that looked like it had been filled out by hand. The date was wrong. It showed a date from 2003. I figured their system was just outdated. As I was pulling out of the parking lot, I looked back at the gas station. For just a moment, it looked different. Older, more run down, like it had been abandoned for decades. But when I blinked, it was back to normal. I drove for another hour before I found a proper truck stop to sleep at. When I woke up the next morning, I tried to find Mountain View service on my GPS. Nothing. I checked online maps, called local information, even asked other truckers who ran that route regularly. Nobody had ever heard of it. I might have convinced myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me, except it happened again 6 months later. Same route, same time of night, same gas station appearing out of nowhere. This time, I paid more attention to the details. The calendars inside the store all showed dates from 2003. The newspapers were all from that same year. And when I looked closely at the attendants, I realized they weren't just similar. They were identical to the men I'd seen before. Same clothes, same expressions, same movements. I tried to take pictures with my phone, but every photo came out blurred or completely black. I tried to record video, but the file would be corrupted when I tried to play it back later. The third time it happened, I decided to ask questions. I asked the pump attendant how long the station had been there. "Always been here," he said, not looking up from the pump. "My daddy worked here, and his daddy before him." "What year is it?" I asked. He looked at me like I was crazy. 2003, of course. What kind of question is that? I showed him my phone, with the date clearly displayed. He stared at it for a long time, then handed it back to me without saying anything, but I saw something in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or confusion. Inside the store, I found a newspaper dated 3 days ago, but the year was 2003. The headlines were about things I remembered from 20 years ago: the Iraq War, Arnold Schwarzenegger becoming governor of California, the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. I asked the clerk about it. "Time moves different in the mountains," he said. "Always has. Some places get stuck, like a record with a scratch in it." That's when I started to understand. This wasn't just a gas station. It was a place that had gotten trapped in time, replaying the same day over and over. And somehow, when I was driving through that particular stretch of mountain road at that particular time of night, I was slipping into their loop. The fourth time I encountered it, I decided to test something. I left a $1 bill on the counter with my initials written on it. When I came back 6 months later, the same $1 bill was still there, in exactly the same spot. But here's what really scared me. I asked the clerk if he remembered me from before. "Course I do," he said. "You were here yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that." From his perspective, I wasn't visiting every 6 months. I was visiting every day, which means that somewhere, in some version of reality, I never left that gas station. Now I'm still there, trapped in 2003, buying the same cup of coffee over and over again. I've started taking different routes now, even if it adds hours to my drive time. I don't want to risk getting stuck there permanently. But sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains late at night, I'll see that familiar glow in the distance, and part of me wants to pull over. Part of me wants to go back to that simple time when gas was cheaper and the world seemed less complicated. Part of me wants to stay in 2003 forever. That's how they get you, I think. They make you want to stay. If you're ever driving through eastern Kentucky late at night and you see a gas station that doesn't look quite right, keep driving. Don't stop for gas. Don't stop for coffee. Don't stop for anything. Because some places in the mountains don't follow the same rules as the rest of the world. And once you step inside, you might never find your way back to the present. My name is Marcus, and I drive long-haul trucks across the eastern seaboard. Been doing it for 15 years, and I know every truck stop, every gas station, every rest area from Maine to Georgia. I know which places are safe to sleep and which ones you drive past without stopping. But there's one place I can't explain. A place that shouldn't exist, but somehow keeps showing up when I'm driving through the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. It happened for the first time 3 years ago. I was hauling electronics from Cincinnati to Charlotte, running behind schedule because of traffic in Louisville. It was past midnight, and I was getting into that dangerous territory where your eyelids start feeling heavy. The mountain roads through Kentucky are no place to fall asleep at the wheel. I was looking for a place to pull over when I saw the glow of neon lights ahead. A gas station appeared around the curve, sitting by itself in a small valley between two ridges. The sign read, "Mountain View Service," in flickering blue letters. It looked like it had been there since the 1960s, the kind of place with full-service pumps and a mechanic's bay. I pulled in, grateful to find somewhere open. The parking lot was empty except for an old pickup truck parked near the building. As I climbed down from my cab, I noticed how quiet everything was. No highway noise, no insects, no wind, just the hum of the fluorescent lights above the pumps. The attendant who came out was an elderly man with deep-set eyes and calloused hands. He moved slowly, like he had all the time in the world. When he spoke, his voice had that thick mountain accent that sounds like it comes from another century. "Fill her up?" he asked, not really looking at me. I nodded and handed him my company credit card. While he pumped the diesel, I went inside to grab some coffee and use the restroom. The store was exactly what you'd expect from a place like that. Dusty shelves, outdated snacks, a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. But there were things that seemed off. The magazines on the rack were all from 2003. The prices on everything were way too low. Candy bars for 50 cents, coffee for a quarter. And there was a smell in the air, like old wood and something else I couldn't identify. The man behind the counter was different from the pump attendant. Younger, maybe in his 40s, but with the same deep-set eyes. He watched me the entire time I was in the store, never blinking, never moving. When I brought my coffee to the counter, he just stared at me. "You're not from around here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Just passing through," I replied. "Heading south on 119. He tilted his head like he was confused. 119? Ain't no 119 through here. You must be thinking of Route 23. I knew I was on 119. I'd been driving these roads for years, but I didn't want to argue with the locals, so I just paid for my coffee and headed back to my truck. The pump attendant was finishing up with the diesel. When I asked for a receipt, he handed me a slip of paper that looked like it had been filled out by hand. The date was wrong. It showed a date from 2003. I figured their system was just outdated. As I was pulling out of the parking lot, I looked back at the gas station. For just a moment, it looked different, older, more run down, like it had been abandoned for decades. But when I blinked, it was back to normal. I drove for another hour before I found a proper truck stop to sleep at. When I woke up the next morning, I tried to find Mountain View Service on my GPS. Nothing. I checked online maps, called local information, even asked other truckers who ran that route regularly. Nobody had ever heard of it. I might have convinced myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me, except it happened again 6 months later. Same route, same time of night, same gas station appearing out of nowhere. This time, I paid more attention to the details. The calendars inside the store all showed dates from 2003. The newspapers were all from that same year, and when I looked closely at the attendants, I realized they weren't just similar. They were identical to the men I'd seen before. Same clothes, same expressions, same movements. I tried to take pictures with my phone, but every photo came out blurred or completely black. I tried to record video, but the file would be corrupted when I tried to play it back later. The third time it happened, I decided to ask questions. I asked the pump attendant how long the station had been there. "Always been here," he said, not looking up from the pump. "My daddy worked here, and his daddy before him. What year is it? I asked. He looked at me like I was crazy. 2003, of course. What kind of question is that? I showed him my phone with the date clearly displayed. He stared at it for a long time, then handed it back to me without saying anything. But I saw something in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or confusion. Inside the store, I found a newspaper dated 3 days ago, but the year was 2003. The headlines were about things I remembered from 20 years ago. The Iraq War, Arnold Schwarzenegger becoming governor of California, the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. I asked the clerk about it. Time moves different in the mountains, he said. Always has. Some places get stuck, like a record with a scratch in it. That's when I started to understand. This wasn't just a gas station. It was a place that had gotten trapped in time, replaying the same day over and over. And somehow, when I was driving through that particular stretch of mountain road at that particular time of night, I was slipping into their loop. The fourth time I encountered it, I decided to test something. I left a dollar bill on the counter with my initials written on it. When I came back 6 months later, the same dollar bill was still there, in exactly the same spot. But here's what really scared me. I asked the clerk if he remembered me from before. Of course I do, he said. You were here yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. From his perspective, I wasn't visiting every 6 months. I was visiting every day, which means that somewhere, in some version of reality, I never left that gas station. I'm still there, trapped in 2003, buying the same cup of coffee over and over again. I've started taking different routes now, even if it adds hours to my drive time. I don't want to risk getting stuck there permanently. But sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains late at night, I'll see that familiar glow in the distance, and part of me wants to pull over. Part of me wants to go back to that simple time when gas was cheaper and the world seemed less complicated. Part of me wants to stay in 2003 forever. That's how they get you, I think. They make you want to stay. If you're ever driving through eastern Kentucky late at night and you see a gas station that doesn't look quite right, keep driving. Don't stop for gas. Don't stop for coffee. Don't stop for anything. Because some places in the mountains don't follow the same rules as the rest of the world. And once you step inside, you might never find your way back to the present. I used to work as a night auditor at a motel called the Pine Ridge Inn, located on a lonely stretch of highway that winds through the mountains of southwestern Virginia. It wasn't much to look at. A single-story building with 20 rooms, built sometime in the 1970s and showing its age. But it was clean, cheap and convenient for travelers who didn't want to drive the mountain roads after dark. Most of our guests were truckers, traveling salespeople, or families on road trips who just needed a place to sleep for the night. Normal people living normal lives. But there was one room that seemed to attract a different kind of guest. Room 13, at the far end of the building, tucked away from the main parking area. I'd been working there for about 6 months when I first noticed the pattern. People would check into room 13 looking one way, and they'd check out looking completely different. Not physically different. I'm talking about something deeper than that. Something in their eyes, their posture, the way they carried themselves. The first time I really paid attention to it was when a businessman from Richmond checked in. His name was David Patterson, and he was exactly what you'd expect from a corporate type. Expensive suit, confident handshake, talking loudly on his phone about quarterly reports and client meetings. He requested a quiet room, so I gave him room 13. When he checked out the next morning, I barely recognized him. He moved slowly like he was in a daze. His expensive suit was wrinkled and disheveled, and he kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to follow him. When I asked if everything had been satisfactory, he just stared at me for a long moment. "That room," he started, then shook his head. "Never mind. Just never mind." He left without another word, but I noticed he forgot his briefcase. When I called his office later to let him know, his secretary said he'd quit his job that morning. Just walked in, cleaned out his desk, and left without explanation. I might have dismissed it as a coincidence, except it kept happening. A young couple from North Carolina checked into room 13 on their honeymoon. They were all over each other when they arrived, couldn't keep their hands off each other, talking about their future together. The next morning, they checked out in complete silence. They wouldn't even look at each other, and the woman had been crying. A traveling salesman named Jerry, who'd been staying with us for years, always requested room 13 because it was quiet. He was one of those guys who never met a stranger, always had a joke or a story to tell. After his last stay in that room, he became withdrawn and paranoid. Started asking me strange questions about the other guests, wanted to know who had stayed in the room before him. "They're still in there," he whispered to me one night. "I can hear them talking when I try to sleep. They're planning something." I thought he was having some kind of breakdown, but then I started paying closer attention to room 13. I began keeping a log of everyone who stayed there and what condition they were in when they left. The pattern was undeniable. Normal people went in, and changed people came out. The room itself looked ordinary enough. Standard motel furniture, outdated but clean. Beige carpet, wood-paneled walls, a painting of a mountain landscape that had probably been there since the place opened. The only unusual thing was how cold it always was, even in summer. We could never seem to get the temperature right in that room. I started doing my own investigation. Late at night, when the motel was quiet, I'd walk past room 13 and listen. Sometimes I could hear voices, even when I knew the room was empty. Soft conversations, like people having a meeting, but I could never make out what they were saying. One night, curiosity got the better of me. We had no guests in room 13, and I had a master key. I decided to go inside and see if I could figure out what was making people change. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt it, a heaviness in the air like being underwater. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees, and I could see my breath fogging in the sudden cold. But it wasn't just the physical sensation that bothered me. It was the feeling of being watched. I turned on all the lights and looked around carefully. Everything appeared normal, but there was something wrong with the shadows. They seemed too dark, too deep, like they were hiding something. And there was a smell in the air, faint but unmistakable. It reminded me of old paper and dust, like an abandoned library. I was about to leave when I noticed something about the mirror above the dresser. My reflection looked normal, but there seemed to be other shapes moving behind me in the glass. When I turned around, nothing was there. But when I looked back at the mirror, I could see them again. Vague figures standing in the corners of the room, watching me. That's when I heard the whispers. Not voices exactly, but something like voices. They seemed to be coming from inside my own head, telling me things about myself that no one else could know. Childhood memories I'd forgotten, mistakes I'd made, fears I'd never shared with anyone. The whispers weren't threatening. They were understanding, sympathetic, like old friends who wanted to help. They told me that everyone who stayed in this room learned the truth about themselves, the truth about what they really were, underneath all the lies and pretenses they showed the world. "You don't have to pretend anymore," the whispers said. "You don't have to be what other people expect you to be. You can be honest. You can be real." I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to those whispers, feeling them peel away layers of my personality like old paint. They showed me things about myself I'd never wanted to acknowledge. The resentment I felt toward my family, the jealousy I harbored toward successful people, the small cruelties I inflicted on others without thinking about it. But they also showed me that none of it mattered. All the social conventions, all the rules about how to behave, all the expectations that weighed me down, they were just illusions. In that room, I could be my true self. I could stop pretending to be nice, stop trying to please everyone, stop caring about what other people thought, It was liberating and terrifying. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I managed to break free from whatever hold that room had on me. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air like I'd been drowning. The next morning, I quit my job. I couldn't work at a place that had a room like that, a room that stripped people down to their essential selves and sent them back into the world fundamentally changed. But I understood now why people left room 13 looking different. They'd seen the truth about themselves, and once you see that truth, you can never go back to pretending. Some people couldn't handle it and broke down. Others embraced it and became something darker than they'd been before. The Pine Ridge Inn is still operating as far as I know. New management, new staff, but the same rooms, including room 13. I sometimes wonder if they've noticed the pattern, or if they just think they have unusually eccentric guests. I've never told anyone about what I experienced in that room. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those whispers. They follow me wherever I go, reminding me of what I learned about myself in that cold, dark room. The truth is, we're all wearing masks. We all pretend to be better than we are, kinder than we are, more normal than we are. But there are places in this world where those masks get stripped away, where you have to confront who you really are underneath all the pretense. Room 13 was one of those places, and once you've been there, once you've seen your true self reflected in those dark mirrors, you can never quite convince yourself that the mask is real again. If you ever find yourself staying at a small motel in the mountains and they offer you room 13, I'd suggest asking for a different room, unless you're prepared to meet the person you really are when no one else is watching. Because some truths are better left buried, and some rooms are better left empty. My name is Tyler, and I grew up in Beckley, West Virginia, right in the heart of coal country. The mountains around our town are riddled with old mines, some still operating, others abandoned decades ago when the coal ran out or became too dangerous to extract. Most of the abandoned ones are sealed up tight, but if you know where to look, you can find ways inside. When I was 17, my best friend Connor and I were obsessed with urban exploration. We'd spend weekends checking out abandoned buildings, old factories, anything that had been left to decay. It was Connor who first suggested we explore one of the old coal mines up on Jenkins Mountain. The mine had been closed since 1987 after a cave-in killed 3 miners. The company sealed the main entrance with concrete, but Connor had heard from his older brother that there was another way in. A ventilation shaft about half a mile up the mountain that led into the old tunnel system. We spent weeks planning the expedition. We bought proper headlamps, rope, first aid supplies, and even a gas detector that Connor borrowed from his dad, who worked for the mining company. We weren't stupid kids. We knew the dangers of abandoned mines. Cave-ins, toxic gases, getting lost in the tunnels. But we thought we were prepared. On a Saturday morning in October, we hiked up Jenkins Mountain to find the ventilation shaft. It took us most of the morning, but we finally located it. A circular opening about 4 feet in diameter, hidden behind a screen of mountain laurel. The shaft dropped straight down about 30 feet before connecting to the horizontal tunnels. Connor went first, rappelling down with our rope. I followed a few minutes later. The shaft was tight, barely wide enough for us to fit with our backpacks, and it opened into a tunnel that was maybe 6 feet high and just wide enough for a minecart. The air was stale and cold, with a metallic taste that coated your tongue. Our headlamps cut through the darkness, revealing rough-hewn walls supported by rotting wooden beams. The tunnel stretched ahead of us, disappearing into blackness. We started walking, marking our route with spray paint so we could find our way back. The tunnel branched several times, creating a maze of passages that burrowed deep into the mountain. Some led to dead ends where the coal had been completely extracted. Others opened into larger chambers where the miners had followed rich veins of coal. About an hour into our exploration, we found something that made us stop cold. In one of the larger chambers, there was evidence that someone had been living there, not recently. The stuff looked like it had been there for years, but there were sleeping bags, empty food cans, a camp stove, and dozens of candles melted down to stubs. Homeless guy, maybe? Connor suggested, using the mine for shelter. But something about the setup bothered me. The sleeping bags were arranged in a circle, like people had been sitting around a campfire. There were 5 of them, all facing inward. And scattered around the circle were personal items. Wallets, jewelry, car keys, things that homeless people wouldn't just abandon. I picked up one of the wallets and opened it. The driver's license belonged to a man named Robert Chen from Charleston. The photo showed an Asian man in his 30s, smiling at the camera. The license had expired in 1994. Connor found another wallet. This one belonged to Sarah Mitchell from Huntington, with a license that expired in 1996. Then we found a 3rd one, and a 4th, and a 5th. All from different people, all with expired licenses from the 1990s. "What the hell is this?" Connor whispered. That's when we noticed the walls. Someone had been carving symbols into the rock, crude drawings that covered every surface within reach. Most of them were illegible, but some looked like words. Names, maybe, and dates. Lots of dates, all from the 1990s. We were studying the carvings when we heard it, a sound echoing from deeper in the tunnel system. At first, I thought it was just the mountain settling, or maybe water dripping somewhere. But as we listened, it became clear that it was something else. Voices, human voices, having a conversation somewhere in the darkness ahead of us. Connor and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. We weren't alone in the mine. Someone else was down there, probably squatters or drug users who'd found their way in through another entrance. We decided to investigate, moving carefully through the tunnels toward the sound. The voices got clearer as we got closer, and I could make out individual words. They were discussing something, but the conversation seemed strange. Disjointed, like people talking in their sleep. The voices led us to another chamber, larger than the first one. This one had been set up like some kind of meeting room. There were wooden crates arranged in rows, like pews in a church. At the front of the room, someone had built an altar out of stacked stones, and on that altar were more personal belongings. Dozens of them arranged like offerings, but the chamber was empty. No people, no sign of recent activity. The voices had stopped the moment we entered the room. Connor's gas detector started beeping. He looked at the readout and his face went pale. "We need to get out of here, now. This thing is showing dangerous levels of methane." We turned to leave, but that's when we saw them. 5 figures standing at the entrance to the chamber, blocking our path. They were wearing mining helmets with old-fashioned carbide lamps, the kind they used decades ago. Their clothes were covered in coal dust, and their faces were streaked with dirt. But something was wrong with their faces. They were too pale, too gaunt, like they hadn't seen sunlight in years, and their eyes reflected our headlamp beams like animal eyes in the dark. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said. His voice echoed strangely in the chamber, like it was coming from very far away. "This is our place? We've been waiting so long." Connor grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a side tunnel, but the figures moved to block us. They moved wrong, too fluid, like they were floating instead of walking. "Don't run," another one said. "We just want to talk. We've been so lonely down here. No one comes to visit anymore." That's when I realized what we were looking at. These weren't living people. These were the miners who had died in the cave-in back in 1987, but somehow they were still here, still working their shifts in the darkness. "We found the others," the first figure continued, "the ones who came looking for adventure, like you. They stayed with us. They're part of the mine now." He gestured toward the altar, and I understood what all those personal belongings represented. They belonged to explorers like us, people who had found their way into the mine over the years and never made it back out. Connor's gas detector was beeping frantically now. The methane levels were climbing rapidly, which meant we were in immediate danger of an explosion. But the figures didn't seem concerned about the gas. They probably couldn't be hurt by it anymore. "The mountain is hungry," one of them whispered. "It needs to be fed. Coal isn't enough anymore. It needs something more." I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment we were standing there listening to those impossible voices, and the next we were sprinting through the tunnels, our headlamps bouncing wildly as we tried to find our way back to the ventilation shaft. Behind us, I could hear them following. Not footsteps, but something else. A sound like rocks sliding, like the mountain itself was moving. And their voices calling after us in the darkness. "You can't leave. You belong here now. The mountain has claimed you." We got lost twice trying to find our way back, the spray paint marks we'd left seeming to lead us in circles. But finally, we saw the rope hanging down from the ventilation shaft. Connor went up first, and I was right behind him, climbing faster than I'd ever climbed in my life. We emerged into daylight, gasping and shaking, covered in coal dust and terror. As we were coiling up our rope, we heard an explosion echo from deep inside the mountain. The methane had finally ignited, probably triggered by the carbide lamps those figures were wearing. We never reported what we found in that mine. Who would believe us? Instead, we drove straight to the state police and told them we'd heard voices coming from the old Jenkins Mountain mine. We said we thought someone might be trapped inside. The rescue team that went in found the bodies. 5 miners who had been missing since the 1987 cave-in, their remains finally recovered after all those years. They also found evidence of other people who had been in the mine more recently. Personal belongings, camping gear, and human remains that matched several missing persons reports from the EO 1990s. The official report blamed the deaths on methane poisoning and cave-ins. The mine was permanently sealed with concrete and steel barriers that would prevent anyone from ever entering it again. But I know the truth. Those miners didn't just die in that cave-in 30 years ago. They became part of the mountain, part of the darkness that lives in the deep places of the earth. And they were collecting others to join them, feeding the hunger of something that existed long before humans ever started digging into these hills. Connor moved to Florida after we graduated high school. He never wanted to see another mountain as long as he lived. But I stayed in West Virginia, and sometimes, when I'm driving past Jenkins Mountain late at night, I can still hear them calling. Not with voices, but with something deeper than sound. A vibration in the rock, a whisper in the wind, an invitation to come back and join them in the darkness below. The mountains are old here, older than human memory, and they're hungry. They've been feeding on coal for millions of years, but coal burns out eventually. They need something that burns longer, something that can keep the darkness company for eternity. If you ever find yourself in coal country and you see an abandoned mine entrance that's been left unsealed, don't go inside. No matter how curious you are, no matter how safe it looks, don't go inside. Because some places aren't meant for the living, and once you go deep enough into the mountain, you might find that you can never come back to the surface again. I don't usually ask, but if this story is getting under your skin, show it some love. It really helps. I worked for the U.S. Census Bureau for 12 years, mostly covering rural areas in Kentucky and West Virginia. It's not glamorous work, but I like the travel and the chance to meet people from all walks of life. Most folks are friendly enough, even if they're suspicious of government workers. But there was one family I encountered that still gives me nightmares. It was during the 2010 census, and I was assigned to cover some of the most remote areas of eastern Kentucky. Places where the roads are barely more than dirt tracks, where people live so far back in the mountains that they might as well be on another planet. My supervisor warned me that some of these families hadn't been counted in decades, either because they were impossible to reach or because they actively avoided government contact. The Whitlock family fell into the second category. According to our records, there had been Whitlocks living on Crow's Nest Mountain since at least 1920, but no one from the family had responded to a census since 1960. The local post office said they'd never delivered mail to that address. The county sheriff told me that deputies had tried to reach the property several times over the years for various reasons, but they'd never been able to find anyone home. Strange bunch, Sheriff Hawkins told me. Keep to themselves. Don't come to town. Don't seem to need anything from the outside world. But folks see smoke from their chimney, so we know someone's up there. He gave me directions to their property, though he warned me that the road was barely passable and I'd probably have to hike the last mile or so. He also mentioned something that stuck with me. If you do find them, don't stay too long. There's something not right about that family. Always has been. I drove up Crow's Nest Mountain on a gray October morning, following a winding dirt road that got narrower and rougher with every mile. Eventually, my car couldn't go any further, so I parked and continued on foot. The forest was thick and dark, with old-growth trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The only sounds were my footsteps on the fallen leaves and the occasional call of a crow. After about an hour of hiking, I smelled wood smoke and knew I was getting close. The path led to a clearing where I found the Whitlock property, a cluster of buildings that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1800s. There was a main house, a barn, several outbuildings, and what looked like a small family cemetery on a hill overlooking the compound. The main house was a 2-story log structure with a stone chimney that was indeed producing smoke. The windows were small and dirty, and I couldn't see any signs of modern conveniences. No power lines, no satellite dish, no vehicles. It was like stepping back in time. I knocked on the front door and waited. After a few minutes, it opened to reveal a woman who looked to be in her 60s, though it was hard to tell. She was thin and pale, with long gray hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face. She wore a simple dress that looked homemade and boots that had seen better decades. "Ma'am, I'm with the U.S. Census Bureau," I said, showing her my identification. "I'm here to conduct the official population count for this household." She stared at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she called over her shoulder, "Pa, government man's here." An elderly man appeared beside her. He was tall and gaunt, with a long white beard and the same oversized eyes as the woman. He looked me up and down like he was evaluating livestock. "What you want with us?" he asked. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it very often. I explained about the census, how it was required by law, how the information would be kept confidential. They listened without changing expression, then stepped aside to let me enter. The inside of the house was even stranger than the outside. The rooms were lit by kerosene lamps and heated by a wood stove. The furniture looked handmade and ancient. But what struck me most was how many people were in that house. They kept appearing from different rooms as I talked with the elderly couple. First 2 more adults, then several children, then teenagers, then more adults. I counted at least 20 people living in that house, all with the same pale complexion and oversized eyes. "This is quite a large family," I commented, trying to keep track of everyone for my forms. "We don't believe in leaving the mountain," the old man said. "This is where we belong. This is where we stay." As I interviewed each family member, I started to notice some disturbing patterns. None of them could tell me their exact age. None of them had ever left the mountain, not even to go to town. None of them could read or write. And when I asked about births and deaths in the family, they gave me answers that didn't make sense. "How many children have been born in this household in the past 10 years?" I asked the elderly woman, who seemed to be the matriarch. "All of them," she replied. "They're all our children. I mean specifically in the last 10 years. For the census, I need exact numbers and dates." She looked confused, like the concept of counting years was foreign to her. "Time don't work the same way up here," she said. "Children come when they're needed. People pass when it's their time." I tried a different approach. "Can you tell me the names and ages of everyone living in this house?" That's when things got really strange. As she started listing names, I realized that several of the people she was describing looked identical to others in the room. Not similar, identical, like they were the same person appearing multiple times. And the ages she gave me were impossible. She claimed to be 67, but said her oldest son was 71. She said her husband was 89, but he looked younger than she did. Some of the children she claimed were 8 or 9 years old, but they looked like teenagers. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion about the ages here," I said gently. That's when all conversation in the room stopped. Every member of the family turned to look at me with those oversized eyes, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Ain't no confusion," the old man said slowly. "You're the one who's confused. You're thinking like someone from down in the world. But we ain't from the world. We're from the mountain." I tried to continue with the census, but the family's answers became increasingly bizarre. They claimed to have relatives who had died decades ago, but were still living in the house. They talked about children who had been born before their parents. They described a family tree that folded in on itself like a Mobius strip. And the more questions I asked, the more agitated they became. "Why you need to know all this?" one of the younger men demanded. "What business is it of yours how we live?" "It's just for the official count," I explained. "The government needs to know how many people live in each area." "Government," the old man spat. "Government don't have no claim on us. We've been here since before there was a government. We'll be here after it's gone." The tension in the room was getting thick, and I was starting to feel genuinely threatened. There were at least 20 of them and one of me, and we were miles from the nearest neighbor. I decided to wrap up the interview as quickly as possible. But as I was preparing to leave, one of the children, a little girl who looked maybe 10 years old, grabbed my arm. "Don't go back down the mountain," she whispered. "Stay with us. It's better here. Time don't hurt you here." I looked into her eyes and saw something that made my blood freeze. Those weren't the eyes of a child. They were ancient, filled with knowledge and experience that no 10-year-old should possess. "I have to go," I said, gently pulling my arm away. "No, you don't," the old man said. "You could stay, become part of the family. We got room for one more." The way he said it didn't sound like an invitation. It sounded like a threat. I made my excuses and headed for the door, but the family followed me outside. They stood in a line, watching as I gathered my things and started back down the path. I could feel their eyes on me long after I'd entered the forest. The hike back to my car felt like it took forever. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding one of them. Every sound made me jump. When I finally reached my vehicle, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight back to town and filed my report, but I couldn't bring myself to include all the details. How do you explain to your supervisor that you'd encountered a family that seemed to exist outside of normal time? How do you document people who claim to be their own ancestors? I submitted a basic count, 23 people living at the Whitlock property, and left it at that. But I couldn't stop thinking about them. I did some research at the county courthouse, looking through old records and property deeds. What I found made me wish I'd never climbed that mountain. The Whitlock family had indeed been living on Crow's Nest Mountain since at least 1920, but according to the records, it was the same Whitlocks. The names on the 1920 census were identical to the names I'd recorded in 2010. Same people, same ages, same family structure. It was as if 90 years had passed in the outside world, but no time at all had passed on that mountain. I transferred to a different region after that, telling my supervisor I wanted to work closer to home. But sometimes, when I'm driving through mountain country, I think about the Whitlock family. Are they still up there, living in their timeless bubble? Are they still the same ages, still wearing the same clothes, still heating their house with the same wood stove? And sometimes I wonder if that little girl was right. Maybe it would be better to live somewhere that time can't touch you. Maybe growing old and dying is just another government program we've all been tricked into accepting. But then I remember those ancient eyes in that child's face, and I'm grateful to be living in a world where time moves forward and people eventually get to rest. Some families are bound by love, others by tradition, but the Whitlocks were bound by something else entirely, something that kept them frozen in place while the rest of the world moved on without them. If you ever find yourself driving through the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky and you see smoke rising from a chimney where no house should be, keep driving. Don't investigate, don't try to help, don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because some families don't want visitors, and some places exist outside the normal flow of time where a brief visit might last forever. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years, and I've picked up my share of hitchhikers over the miles. Most of them are just folks down on their luck, trying to get from one place to another without the money for a bus ticket. I've always believed in helping people when I can, and the company of a passenger makes the long drives go by faster. But there's one hitchhiker I picked up that still haunts me, and it happened on one of the loneliest stretches of highway I've ever driven. Route 219 through the mountains of West Virginia. It was late November, about 3 years ago. I was hauling a load of furniture from High Point, North Carolina to Pittsburgh, and I'd chosen to take 219 north through West Virginia instead of the interstate. It's a longer route, but it's more scenic, and I wasn't in any particular hurry. The weather had been getting worse all day. What started as light snow had turned into a full blizzard by the time I reached the mountain passes. Visibility was down to maybe 50 feet, and the wind was howling across the highway like something alive and angry. I was creeping along at about 30 miles per hour, fighting to keep my rig on the road, when I saw a figure standing beside the highway. It was a woman, thumb out, obviously looking for a ride. She wasn't dressed for the weather, just jeans, a light jacket, and sneakers. No hat, no gloves, no scarf. In that blizzard, she should have been frozen solid. I pulled over and rolled down my passenger window. "You need a ride, ma'am." She nodded and climbed up into the cab. She looked to be in her 30s, with dark hair and pale skin. Pretty, but there was something about her eyes that seemed distant, like she was looking at something far away. "Thank you so much," she said. "I've been waiting out there for hours." "Where are you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the highway. "North," she said. "Just north. I'll let you know when to stop." It wasn't the most specific destination I'd ever heard, but I figured she knew where she was going. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds being the rumble of my engine and the wind battering the sides of the truck. After about 20 minutes, she started talking. "Do you ever think about the people who've died on this road?" It was an odd question, but highway deaths were an occupational hazard in my line of work. "I try not to dwell on it," I said. "But yeah, I've seen some bad accidents over the years." "This stretch of 219 is particularly dangerous," she continued. "The curves, the weather, the way the mountains seem to close in on you. A lot of people don't make it through." She was right about that. Route 219 through West Virginia had a reputation among truckers. It was beautiful country, but it could be treacherous, especially in winter. I'd heard stories of cars sliding off the mountain roads, of trucks jackknifing on icy curves, of people getting lost in blizzards and freezing to death. "You seem to know this area pretty well," I said. "I should," she replied. "I've been traveling this road for a long time." We continued driving through the storm. The snow was getting heavier, and I was having to use all my concentration just to keep the truck moving forward. But my passenger seemed completely relaxed, like the weather didn't bother her at all. "Can you turn the heat down?" she asked. "It's getting warm in here." I looked at the temperature gauge. The heat wasn't even on. The cab was staying warm just from the engine heat, but she was right. It did seem to be getting warmer. I cracked the window a little to let some cold air in. "That's better," she said. "I don't like it when it gets too hot." About an hour into the trip, she started telling me stories about the road. Not just general stories, but specific ones. Detailed accounts of accidents that had happened on particular curves, descriptions of people who had died at exact mile markers. Right up ahead, around that bend, a family from Ohio went off the road in 1987, she said, pointing into the darkness. Car hit a patch of ice and went right through the guardrail. Father, mother, 2 children. They didn't find the bodies until spring. I couldn't see anything through the snow, but something about the way she described it made me believe she was telling the truth. "How do you know all this?" "I pay attention," she said. "When you spend enough time on a road, you learn its history." She told me about a trucker who jackknifed his rig in 1993, spilling a load of chemicals that burned for 3 days. About a young couple who'd run out of gas in a blizzard in 2001 and been found frozen in their car. About a bus full of high school students that had slid off the mountain in 1978. Each story was told with perfect detail, names, dates, exact locations. It was like she'd been there for all of them. "You must have an incredible memory," I said. "Some things you don't forget," she replied. We were passing through a particularly desolate section of the highway when she asked me to pull over. "This is where I get out." I looked around. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. The storm was still raging and the temperature had to be well below freezing. "Are you sure? There's nothing out here." "This is the place," she insisted. "I'll be fine." Against my better judgment, I pulled over to the shoulder. She opened the door and climbed down from the cab, then turned back to look at me. "Thank you for the ride," she said. "Drive carefully. This road takes more than it gives." "Wait," I called after her. "At least let me give you my jacket. You'll freeze out there." But she was already walking away, disappearing into the swirling snow like she'd never been there at all. I sat there for a few minutes, watching for her in my mirrors. But she was gone. I felt terrible about leaving someone out in that storm, but she'd insisted this was where she wanted to be dropped off. I continued north, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong. The way she'd known so much about accidents on that road, the way she'd seemed unaffected by the cold, the way she'd vanished into the storm without any concern for her safety. When I reached the truck stop in Elkins, I asked the cashier about Route 219, whether there had been any recent accidents or missing persons reports. She looked at me strangely. "You mean besides the woman they found yesterday?" she said. "What woman?" "Some hiker found a body about 10 miles south of here, right off 219. Been there for weeks, maybe months. Frozen solid. They think she was trying to hitchhike when she got caught in a storm." My blood went cold. What did she look like? Dark hair, about 30 years old. Pretty, from what I heard. Wearing jeans and a light jacket. Not dressed for winter weather at all. I drove straight to the state police barracks and told them about the hitchhiker I'd picked up. They listened politely, but I could tell they thought I was confused or making it up. The woman's body had been found the day before I'd encountered her, and she'd been dead for weeks. "Maybe you picked up someone else," the officer suggested. "Someone who just happened to look similar." But I knew what I'd experienced. I'd spent 2 hours in that truck cab with someone who had known details about accidents on Route 219 that weren't in any public records. Someone who had seemed unaffected by a blizzard that was making experienced truckers like me fight for control of their vehicles. I've driven Route 219 many times since then, but I've never seen her again. Other truckers have told me similar stories, though. A woman who appears during bad weather, asking for rides north. She always knows too much about the road's history, and she always disappears at the same spot. Some say she's the ghost of that hiker who froze to death trying to get a ride. Others think she's something older, something that's been traveling that road since long before it was paved. A spirit that feeds on the tragedies that happen in those mountains, collecting stories of death and disaster like other people collect postcards. I don't know what she was, but I know she wasn't human. Not anymore, anyway. She was something that belonged to that road, part of the darkness that lives in the mountain passes, where civilization gets thin and the old rules don't apply. If you're ever driving Route 219 through West Virginia during a storm and you see a woman hitchhiking in clothes that aren't warm enough for the weather, don't stop. Keep driving, no matter how bad you feel about leaving someone out in the cold. Because some passengers aren't looking for a ride to somewhere else. They're looking for company on a journey that never ends, through storms that never stop, on a road that leads nowhere but deeper into the darkness of the mountains. And once you pick them up, you might find that you can never really drop them off again. My name is Rebecca, and I used to be a wildlife biologist working for the Forest Service in the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. I spent most of my time alone in the woods, studying animal populations and monitoring environmental conditions. It was solitary work, but I loved it. There's something peaceful about being deep in the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife. That peace was shattered during the summer of 2018 when I encountered something in those woods that I still can't explain. I was conducting a survey of bird populations in a remote section of the forest, about 15 miles from the nearest road. It was an area that saw very few visitors, too far from any trails for casual hikers, too rough for most researchers. Perfect for my work since I needed to observe wildlife behavior without human interference. I'd set up a base camp in a small clearing and had been there for 3 days, recording bird calls and tracking migration patterns. Everything was normal until the third night, when I was woken up around 2 a.m. by a sound I'd never heard before. It started as a low humming, almost like the sound of power lines, but deeper and more organic. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground and up through my sleeping bag. At first, I thought it might be some kind of machinery, maybe logging equipment operating at night. But as I listened, the sound began to change. The humming became more complex, developing harmonies and rhythms that no machine could produce. It was almost musical, but in a way that made my skin crawl, like a song being sung by something that didn't understand what music was supposed to sound like. I unzipped my tent and looked outside. The forest was completely still. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing but that strange humming that seemed to come from the trees themselves. My equipment was picking up the sound too. The digital recorder I used for bird calls was showing massive audio spikes way beyond anything it should have been detecting. The humming continued for about 20 minutes, then gradually faded away. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening for it to return, but the forest remained quiet. The next day, I tried to find a rational explanation. I checked my equipment, thinking maybe there was some kind of electrical interference. I looked for signs of human activity, thinking maybe there was a road or facility nearby that I didn't know about. I even called my supervisor to ask if there were any industrial operations in the area. Nothing. The forest was as remote and undeveloped as I'd thought. That evening, the sound came back. This time it started earlier, around 10 p.m., and it was louder. The humming had evolved into something more complex, multiple tones weaving together in patterns that hurt to listen to. It was like hearing a conversation in a language that human ears weren't designed to process. I tried to record it with my professional equipment, but every recording came out as static. The sound was there, my meters were showing it, but somehow it wouldn't capture properly. It was like it existed in some frequency range that technology couldn't handle. On the fourth night, something changed. The sound didn't just come from the forest. It came from inside my tent. I woke up to find that humming resonating through my sleeping bag, through my body, through my bones. It was like being inside a giant speaker, feeling the vibrations in my chest and skull. But when I sat up, the sound seemed to move away from me, always staying just out of reach. That's when I realized it wasn't just a sound. It was intelligent. It was aware of me, and it was trying to communicate. I packed up my camp the next morning and hiked back to my truck, but the sound followed me. Not constantly, but in brief episodes throughout the day. I'd be walking along a trail, and suddenly that humming would start up in the trees around me. It would last for a few minutes, then fade away. Like whatever was making it was keeping pace with me through the forest. By the time I reached my truck, I was exhausted and on edge. But I thought that leaving the forest would end it. I was wrong. The sound followed me home. That first night back in my apartment in Lexington, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the familiar humming. It was quieter than it had been in the forest, but it was definitely there. It seemed to be coming from the walls, like the building itself was vibrating. I checked with my neighbors the next day, but none of them had heard anything unusual. I called the building maintenance, thinking maybe there was a problem with the HVAC system. They found nothing wrong. The sound came back every night for a week, always around 2 a.m., always lasting about 20 minutes. I tried everything I could think of: earplugs, white noise machines, even sleeping pills. Nothing blocked it out. The humming seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my brain. I started keeping a journal, documenting each episode. The pattern was consistent. 2 a.m. start time, 20-minute duration. Same complex harmonic structure. But there were subtle variations. Like the sound was evolving, learning, becoming more sophisticated. After 2 weeks of sleepless nights, I decided to do some research. I contacted other biologists who had worked in remote forest areas, asking if they'd ever encountered unusual acoustic phenomena. Most of them dismissed my questions, but a few shared similar experiences. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had worked in the Olympic National Forest, told me about a humming sound she'd encountered in old-growth areas. She called it forest resonance, and theorized that it might be produced by the root systems of ancient trees communicating through underground networks. But her description didn't match what I was experiencing. Her sound had been pleasant, almost meditative. Mine was disturbing, alien, like hearing the voice of something that shouldn't exist. It was Dr. Martin Rodriguez from the University of Tennessee who gave me the information that changed everything. He'd been studying acoustic anomalies in Appalachian forests for over 20 years, and he knew exactly what I was describing. "You've encountered what we call a sound shadow," he told me over the phone. "It's a phenomenon that occurs in certain remote forest areas, usually associated with locations that have experienced significant trauma." What kind of trauma? Mass deaths, ecological disasters, sometimes historical events, battlefields, massacre sites, places where a lot of people died violently. The theory is that intense emotional energy can become imprinted on the landscape, manifesting as acoustic phenomena. He told me that the area where I'd been working had a dark history. In the 1800s, it had been the site of a Cherokee settlement that was attacked by white settlers. Dozens of people had been killed, their bodies left to rot in the forest. The land had never been properly cleared or consecrated. "The sound you're hearing isn't random," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "It's the echo of voices from the past, still trying to communicate, and once it makes contact with someone who's sensitive to it, it tends to follow them." "How do I make it stop?" "You don't," he said quietly. "It becomes part of you. The best you can do is learn to live with it." He was right. The sound never stopped completely. It's been 3 years now, and I still hear it regularly. Not every night anymore, but often enough that I've had to restructure my entire life around it. I left my job with the Forest Service. I couldn't handle being alone in remote areas anymore, knowing that I might encounter other sound shadows, other echoes of past traumas. I moved to a different apartment, thinking that might help, but the sound followed me there too. I've learned to recognize the patterns. The humming gets stronger during times of stress or emotional turmoil. It's loudest during the anniversary dates of historical tragedies. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I can almost make out individual voices within the harmonic structure. They're not speaking English. They're not speaking any language I recognize. But I understand them anyway. On some level deeper than words, they're trying to tell me their stories, to make sure someone remembers what happened to them in that forest over a century ago. I've started volunteering with historical preservation societies, helping to research and document the forgotten tragedies of Appalachian history. It seems to help. When I'm actively working to preserve these stories, the sound becomes less intrusive, more like background music than an assault on my senses. But it never goes away completely. It's become part of my life, a constant reminder that the past doesn't stay buried in places like the Appalachian Mountains. The land remembers everything, every death, every tragedy, every moment of intense emotion that has ever occurred on its surface. If you work in remote forest areas, especially in regions with dark histories, be careful what you listen for. Not all sounds in the wilderness come from animals or weather. Some of them come from much deeper sources, from events that happened long before you were born but refuse to be forgotten. And if you ever hear a humming in the woods that doesn't sound quite natural, that seems to follow you as you move, don't try to investigate it. Don't try to record it. Just leave as quickly and quietly as you can. Because some sounds aren't meant for living ears. They're messages from the dead, and once you hear them clearly, they'll never stop trying to make you listen. The mountains have long memories, and they're not always kind to those who disturb their secrets. I grew up in a small town called Pine Hollow, tucked away in the mountains of Southwestern Virginia. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where kids could play in the woods all day without their parents worrying, and where the biggest excitement was the annual Corn Festival. When I was 8 years old, my family moved to a house at the edge of town, right where the residential area met the forest. Our backyard ended at a line of old oak trees, beyond which stretched miles of wilderness that most people avoided. My parents told me I could play in our yard, but I was never supposed to go into those woods alone. Of course, like most kids, I ignored that rule. It was during my second week at the new house that I met him. I was exploring the edge of the tree line, looking for interesting rocks and maybe some salamanders, when I heard someone call my name. "Danny!" I turned around and saw a boy about my age standing between two large trees. He had dark hair and pale skin, and he was wearing clothes that looked kind of old-fashioned, like something from a history book. But what struck me most were his eyes. They were gray, almost silver, and they seemed too bright for the shadow of the forest. "How do you know my name?" I asked. "I heard your mom calling you yesterday," he said with a grin. "I'm Thomas. I live back in the woods." "There aren't any houses back there," I said. "Not the kind you're thinking of," he replied. "Want to see?" I should have said no. I should have remembered my parents' warning about going into the woods. But Thomas seemed friendly, and I was curious about where he lived. So I followed him into the forest. He led me along what looked like an old path, winding between the trees and over fallen logs. We walked for what felt like miles, though it couldn't have been that far because I could still hear traffic from the road occasionally. Finally, we came to a clearing where there was indeed a house. But it wasn't like any house I'd ever seen. It was made of logs and stones, with a roof covered in moss and small plants. There were no power lines leading to it, no driveway, no mailbox. It looked like it had grown out of the forest floor rather than being built there. "This is where I live," Thomas said proudly. "Where are your parents?" I asked. "They're around," he said vaguely. "They don't like visitors much, but they don't mind if you come play with me." We spent the afternoon playing games, hide and seek, tag, climbing trees. Thomas was incredibly good at all of them. He could climb higher than seemed possible, hide in places where I couldn't find him even when I was looking right at him, and run faster than any kid I'd ever met. When it started getting dark, he walked me back to the edge of the woods. "Can you come back tomorrow?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, "if my parents don't find out." "They won't," he said with certainty. "Adults don't see things the way kids do." That became our routine. Every day after school, I'd sneak into the woods to play with Thomas. We'd explore the forest, build forts out of branches and stones, and tell each other stories. He knew all the best places to find interesting insects, which berries were safe to eat, and how to move through the woods without making any noise. But there were things about Thomas that bothered me, even as a kid. He never seemed to get tired, no matter how much we ran around. He never got dirty, even when we were crawling through mud or climbing in dusty old trees. And he knew things that he shouldn't have known. He could predict the weather days in advance. He knew when my parents were going to fight before they started arguing. He could tell me what was happening at school even though he'd never been there. When I asked him how he knew these things, he'd just smile and say he was good at guessing. The strangest thing was how the animals reacted to him. Usually forest creatures would run away when they heard kids approaching, but with Thomas, they'd come closer. Deer would walk right up to him. Birds would land on his shoulders. Once, I saw a black bear approach him like a friendly dog, and Thomas petted it like it was completely normal. "How do you do that?" I asked. "Do what?" "Make the animals like you so much." "I speak their language," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I played with Thomas all summer, and our friendship continued into the fall. But as the weather got colder, I started noticing changes in him. His skin became even paler, almost translucent. His eyes got brighter, like they had their own light source. And sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch him staring at me with an expression that made me uncomfortable. It was in late October when things took a disturbing turn. We were playing in his clearing when I noticed something I'd never seen before. A circle of stones arranged around what looked like the remains of a fire pit. But the stones weren't ordinary rocks. They were carved with symbols that looked ancient and somehow wrong. "What's that?" I asked, pointing at the circle. Thomas's expression changed immediately. The friendly smile disappeared, replaced by something colder. "That's not for children to know about," he said. "But we're both children," I pointed out. "No," he said quietly, "we're not." That's when I really looked at him, maybe for the first time. His clothes weren't just old-fashioned. They were old, faded and worn in a way that suggested they'd been around for decades. His skin wasn't just pale. It was the color of something that had never seen sunlight. And his eyes weren't just bright. They were glowing with a light that had nothing to do with any natural source. "What are you?" I whispered. "I'm your friend," he said. But his voice sounded different now, older. "I've been waiting for someone like you for a very long time. Someone like me. Someone who can see me. Someone who can play with me. Someone who might want to stay." "Stay where?" "Here, with me. Forever." The way he said "forever" made my blood run cold. I started backing away from him toward the path that led home. "Don't be afraid," he said, following me. "It's wonderful here. You never have to grow up, never have to worry about school or chores or parents who don't understand you. We can play together always." "I want to go home," I said. "This is your home now," he replied. "Or it could be if you let it." I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear Thomas calling my name, but his voice was changing, becoming something that didn't sound human anymore. It echoed through the trees like the howl of some wild animal. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes, until I finally burst out of the tree line into my backyard. I ran straight into the house and slammed the door behind me. My parents found me in my room an hour later, still shaking. They wanted to know what was wrong, but how could I explain? How could I tell them that I'd been playing with something that pretended to be a child, but was actually something much older and more dangerous? I told them I'd gotten lost in the woods and scared myself. They believed me, and they reinforced their rule about not going into the forest alone. But Thomas didn't give up. For weeks after that, I'd hear him calling my name from the woods at night. Sometimes I'd see him standing at the edge of the tree line, just watching our house. During the day, I'd find little gifts on our back porch. Interesting rocks, carved sticks, wildflowers that shouldn't have been blooming in November. The gifts stopped coming after the first snow. I thought maybe Thomas had gone away, or maybe whatever he was had found someone else to play with. I was wrong. 20 years later, I brought my own 8-year-old son to visit my parents, who still lived in the same house. On our second day there, my son came running in from the backyard, excited about something. "Dad, there's a boy in the woods who wants to play with me." My blood went cold. "What boy?" "His name is Thomas. He's got really cool gray eyes, and he knows all kinds of games. He says he's been waiting for me." I looked out the window toward the tree line, and there he was. Thomas, looking exactly the same as he had when I was 8 years old. Still wearing the same old-fashioned clothes, still with that pale skin and those silver eyes. He saw me watching and smiled, raising his hand in a little wave. Then he pointed at my son and mouthed the word, "perfect." We left that afternoon, cutting our visit short. I told my parents there was an emergency at work, but the truth was I couldn't risk staying another night. I couldn't risk Thomas getting his hands on my son the way he'd almost gotten his hands on me. I never told my son the real reason we left so suddenly. How could I explain that his new friend wasn't a child at all, but something that fed on childhood, something that collected young playmates and kept them forever in a place where time didn't work the same way? But sometimes, when my son is playing alone in our yard, I catch him talking to someone who isn't there. And when I ask him who he's talking to, he just smiles and says, "My friend Thomas. He says he's going to visit me soon." I've started looking into moving to a different state, somewhere far from any mountains or deep forests, because I know that Thomas is patient and persistent, and he's been waiting for a very long time to add another child to his collection. Some friendships are meant to last forever, but when forever means being trapped in an endless childhood with something that only pretends to be human, it's not a gift, it's a curse. If your child ever tells you about a new friend they met in the woods, a friend who never seems to age or get dirty or tired, don't dismiss it as imagination. Ask questions, pay attention, and whatever you do, don't let them go back to play with that friend alone, because some games never end. And some playmates never let you grow up. I'm a cartographer by profession, which means I make maps for a living. It's more technical than most people realize. We use satellite imagery, GPS coordinates, and ground surveys to create accurate representations of geographic areas. I've been doing this work for 15 years. Mostly for government agencies and private companies that need detailed maps of remote areas. In 2019, I was contracted by the state of West Virginia to update their official highway maps. It was routine work, checking road conditions and verifying that all the small towns and landmarks were accurately represented. Most of the job involved driving around with GPS equipment, taking photographs, and cross-referencing existing maps with current conditions. I was working on a section of Route 50 that winds through the mountains of central West Virginia when I encountered something that shouldn't have been possible. According to my GPS and the existing maps, there should have been nothing but forest for about 30 miles between the towns of Grafton and Clarksburg. But as I was driving that stretch of highway, I came across a town that wasn't on any of my maps. It wasn't just a crossroads or a cluster of houses. It was a full town, complete with a main street, shops, a post office, and what looked like several hundred residents. There was even a welcome sign as I drove in. Welcome to Millbrook, West Virginia. Population 847. Established 1952. I pulled over and checked all my reference materials. No mention of Millbrook anywhere. I checked my GPS. It showed me driving through empty forest. I called my supervisor to ask if there had been any recent additions to the state's incorporated communities. He'd never heard of Millbrook either. Curious, I decided to drive through the town and document it properly. If there was a community that had been missed by the state mapping systems, it was my job to correct that oversight. Millbrook looked like a typical small mountain town, the kind you'd find all over West Virginia. The buildings were mostly from the 1950s and 60s, well-maintained but showing their age. There was a main street with a few shops, a general store, a diner, a gas station, a barber shop. Side streets branched off with modest houses, each with small yards and gardens. What struck me immediately was how clean and orderly everything looked. Most small towns in remote areas show signs of economic decline, boarded-up shops, overgrown lots, buildings in need of repair. But Millbrook looked prosperous and well cared for, like it was stuck in a more optimistic era. I parked in front of the general store and went inside to ask some questions. The man behind the counter was elderly, probably in his 70s, with the kind of weathered face you see on people who've spent their lives in the mountains. "Afternoon," he said with a friendly smile. "Don't think I've seen you around before." "I'm working on updating the state highway maps," I explained. "I'm surprised to find Millbrook here. It's not on any of our current maps." His expression changed slightly, becoming more guarded. "Well, we've always been here. Maybe your maps are just outdated. When was the town incorporated?" 1952, just like the sign says. Been here ever since." I bought a soda and asked if he had any local maps or brochures, anything that might help me document the town properly. He said they didn't have anything like that, but suggested I talk to the mayor if I had official questions. The mayor's office was in a small building on Main Street. The mayor himself was a man in his 60s named Robert Hayes, who seemed genuinely puzzled by my questions about the town not being on state maps. "That's odd," he said, looking through some files in his desk. "We've been paying state taxes for decades. We have a post office, a volunteer fire department, even a state police barracks about 10 miles north. How could we not be on the maps?" He showed me property deeds, tax records, and other documents that all seemed legitimate. Everything was dated consistently, showing a continuous history going back to 1952. But something about the paperwork bothered me. It all looked too new, too clean, like it had been printed recently rather than accumulated over decades. "Could I get copies of some of these documents?" I asked. "For my records?" "I'm sorry, but these are originals," he said, quickly gathering the papers back up. "I can't let them leave the office." I spent the rest of the afternoon walking around Millbrook, taking photographs and trying to get a sense of the place. Everyone I met was friendly and helpful, but they all seemed to give me the same kinds of answers. Yes, they'd lived there for years. Yes, the town had always been there. No, they didn't understand why it wouldn't be on official maps. What bothered me most was the demographics. In most small mountain towns, you see a mix of ages, some young families, some elderly people, some middle-aged folks. But everyone in Millbrook appeared to be between about 40 and 70 years old. I didn't see a single child or teenager, and no one who looked younger than middle age. I had dinner at the local diner, hoping to learn more from casual conversation. The waitress was a woman named Martha, who claimed to have lived in Millbrook her whole life. "Born and raised right here," she said proudly. "Wouldn't want to live anywhere else." "Do you have family in town?" I asked. "Oh yes, lots of family. We all look out for each other here." "Any children?" Her smile faltered for just a moment. "Children move away when they grow up. That's just how it is in small towns." "All of them?" Well, young people want opportunities we can't provide here. They go to the cities, find jobs, start families. Natural thing. But something about the way she said it didn't ring true. In my experience, even small towns that lose population to urban migration usually have at least some young families, some children. Millbrook seemed to be populated entirely by middle-aged and older adults. I stayed overnight at a small motel on the edge of town. The proprietor was another friendly local who seemed genuinely happy to have a visitor, but when I asked about getting a receipt for my expense report, he said they didn't usually deal with outside businesses and didn't have the right forms. Just pay cash, he suggested. Simpler that way. That night, I tried to research Millbrook online using my laptop and the motel's Wi-Fi. I searched for the town name, looked up the zip code the post office had given me, even tried to find property records through the county database. Nothing. As far as the internet was concerned, Millbrook, West Virginia, did not exist. I called my supervisor again and asked him to do some checking on his end. He promised to look into it and get back to me. The next morning, I decided to drive around the perimeter of the town, trying to get a sense of its exact boundaries and maybe find some landmarks that would help me locate it on satellite imagery. But as I drove the roads leading out of Millbrook, something strange happened. No matter which direction I went, I kept ending up back in the center of town. I'd drive what felt like several miles on a straight road, only to find myself pulling into the same parking spot in front of the general store. It was like the town existed in some kind of geographic loop. Finally, I tried a different approach. I parked my car and walked out of town on foot, following one of the main roads. I walked for what had to be at least 2 miles, marking my path with a GPS unit. But when I checked my position, the GPS showed that I hadn't moved at all. According to the satellite tracking, I was still standing in the center of Millbrook. That's when I realized that Millbrook wasn't just missing from the maps. It existed in some kind of spatial anomaly, a place that was physically present but somehow disconnected from the normal geography of West Virginia. I managed to leave town by driving back the way I'd originally come, retracing my exact route from the day before. It was like following a specific sequence of turns and landmarks that allowed me to exit the geographic loop that contained Millbrook. When I got back to my office, I found that my supervisor had done some research. There had indeed been a town called Millbrook in that area of West Virginia, but it had been abandoned in the 1960s when a coal mining company bought up all the land. The residents had been relocated, and the buildings had been demolished to make way for strip mining. But here's the strange part, he told me. The mining never happened. The company went bankrupt before they could start operations, and the land was eventually sold to the state for forest preservation. According to every record we have, that area has been uninhabited forest for over 50 years. I showed him my photographs of Millbrook, but something was wrong with them. Every picture I'd taken showed nothing but empty forest. The buildings, the people, the streets. None of it had been captured by my camera. "Are you sure you found a town there?" my supervisor asked. "These photos just show trees." I knew what I'd experienced, but I couldn't prove it. I wrote up my report, documenting the area as uninhabited forest, just like the existing maps showed. But I kept copies of all my notes about Millbrook, including the GPS coordinates where I'd found it. 6 months later, I was working on a different project in the same general area. On impulse, I decided to drive back to those coordinates and see if Millbrook was still there. The road was exactly as I remembered it, winding through the mountains between Grafton and Clarksburg. But when I reached the spot where I'd found the town, there was nothing but forest. No buildings, no roads, no sign that a community had ever existed there. I parked and walked into the woods, following what I thought had been Main Street. About 100 yards in, I found something that made my blood run cold. Foundation stones. Dozens of them, arranged in rectangular patterns that matched the layout of buildings I remembered from Millbrook. They were old, covered with moss and partly buried under decades of fallen leaves. But they were definitely the remains of a town. I also found other things. Rusty pieces of metal that might have been signs, fragments of concrete that could have been sidewalks, and in one spot, a corroded metal post that still had the faded remains of lettering, "Welcome to Mill." The rest was too damaged to read. I never found Millbrook again, despite several return trips to the area, but I've heard stories from other people who work in remote areas of West Virginia, surveyors who've encountered towns that aren't on their maps, utility workers who've been asked to service communities that don't officially exist, delivery drivers who've been given addresses in places that GPS says are empty forest. Most of them dismiss these experiences as mistakes or confusion, but I know better. There are places in the mountains that exist outside the normal rules of geography and time. Places where communities that should have been lost to history continue to exist, populated by people who refuse to accept that their time has passed. Millbrook was one of those places, a town that had been erased from the world, but somehow persisted in the spaces between what is and what was. A place where the residents lived in a kind of temporal bubble, unaware that the outside world had moved on without them. If you ever find yourself driving through remote mountain areas and you come across a town that seems too perfect, too well preserved, too disconnected from the modern world, be careful. Take note of exactly how you got there, because you might need to retrace your steps to get back to reality. And don't trust your camera to record what you see. Some places exist only for those who are there to witness them, and they leave no trace for those who come looking later. The mountains are full of lost places, communities that fell through the cracks of history and geography. Most of them stay lost, but sometimes, if you're driving the right road at the right time, you might find yourself visiting a place that shouldn't exist. Just make sure you remember how to leave. My name is David, and until 5 years ago, I was an avid hiker and backpacker. I'd spent most of my adult life exploring the wilderness areas of the eastern United States, from the Adirondacks in New York down to the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. There was something about being alone in the wilderness that recharged my soul, that made me feel connected to something larger than the everyday world of cities and suburbs. The Appalachian Mountains were my favorite destination. I'd hiked hundreds of miles of the Appalachian Trail, explored countless side trails and remote valleys, and camped in some of the most beautiful and isolated places on the continent. I thought I knew those mountains as well as anyone could. I was wrong. In October of 2019, I planned what was supposed to be my final solo backpacking trip before my wife and I started trying to have children. I wanted one last adventure, one final chance to experience the solitude and challenge of wilderness camping before taking on the responsibilities of parenthood. I chose a remote section of the George Washington National Forest in Western Virginia, an area I'd never explored before. According to my maps, there was a network of old logging roads and hunting trails that would take me deep into the back country, far from any other hikers or campers. I started my hike on a Friday morning, planning to spend 4 days exploring the area before hiking back to my car on Tuesday. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, no chance of rain. I had all the gear I needed, plenty of food and water, and years of experience to keep me safe. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. I hiked about 12 miles into the mountains, following old trails that showed little sign of recent use. I found a perfect campsite beside a small creek, surrounded by ancient oak and maple trees that were just beginning to show their fall colors. On Saturday night, I was sitting by my campfire, reading a book and enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest, when I noticed something strange. The normal nighttime sounds. Insects, owls, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, had completely stopped. The silence was absolute and unnatural. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that forests are never truly quiet. There's always something moving, something making noise. But now there was nothing except the crackling of my fire. I sat still and listened, trying to figure out what might have caused all the wildlife to go silent. Sometimes a large predator moving through the area will have that effect, but I hadn't seen any signs of bears or mountain lions. After about 20 minutes, the sounds gradually returned. First the insects, then some night birds, finally the small rustling sounds that indicated normal forest activity. I convinced myself that it had been nothing unusual and went to sleep. Sunday morning, I broke camp early and continued deeper into the mountains. The trails were getting fainter and more overgrown, which was exactly what I wanted. I was looking for places that few people had ever seen, areas that remained truly wild and untouched. Around midday, I came across something that made me stop and reconsider my route. It was a warning sign, but not the usual Forest Service markers I was accustomed to. This sign was hand-painted on a piece of weathered plywood nailed to a tree beside the trail. Danger. Do not proceed beyond this point. Authorized personnel only. Violators will be prosecuted. There was no indication of what agency had posted the sign, no official seals or contact information. It looked like something a private landowner might have put up, but according to my maps, this was all public forest land. I checked my GPS and confirmed that I was still within the boundaries of the George Washington National Forest. As far as I could tell, I had every right to continue on the trail. But something about that sign bothered me. The paint was fresh, like it had been put up recently, and there was something about the wording that seemed off. Authorized personnel only suggested some kind of official operation, but what kind of official operation would be taking place in the middle of a wilderness area? I decided to continue, but more cautiously. If I encountered any actual authorities, I'd explain that I was just a backpacker and turn back if they asked me to. The trail continued for another mile before branching into several smaller paths. I chose the one that seemed to head toward higher ground, thinking I might find a good viewpoint for lunch. That's when I started noticing the trees. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but as I hiked further, it became undeniable. The trees along the trail were wrong, not diseased or damaged, but wrong in a way that was hard to define. They were too uniform. In a natural forest, you expect to see trees of different ages, different sizes, different species all mixed together. But here, the trees were all roughly the same height, the same thickness, the same species. It was like walking through a plantation rather than a wild forest. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that they were all perfectly straight, and they were all exactly the same distance apart. Not approximately the same distance, exactly the same distance, like they'd been planted with surveying equipment. I stopped to examine one of the trees more closely. It was an oak, probably about 40 years old based on its size. But when I looked at the bark, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were marks carved into the trunk, not the random scratches you might expect from animals or weather damage. These were deliberate symbols, carved in a spiral pattern that wound around the tree from bottom to top. I looked at the next tree, and the next. They all had the same markings. Every single tree along the trail had been carved with the same spiral of symbols. I took out my camera to document what I was seeing, but when I looked at the photos later, they showed nothing unusual. Just normal forest, normal trees, no markings visible at all. By this time, I was starting to feel genuinely unsettled. Everything about this area felt artificial, like someone had created an elaborate fake forest for some unknown purpose. I decided to turn back and find a different route. But when I tried to retrace my steps, I couldn't find the trail I'd been following. I was standing in the middle of that strange uniform forest, and there was no clear path in any direction. I checked my GPS, but it was showing an error message. No satellite signal, which should have been impossible in a forest clearing. I tried my cell phone, but it showed no service. which wasn't surprising given how remote the area was. I wasn't panicked yet. I'd been lost in the woods before, and I knew the basic survival rules. Pick a direction and stick with it. Follow water downstream. Stay calm and think clearly. I chose what I thought was south, the direction that should eventually lead me back to my car. But as I walked, the forest remained unnaturally uniform, every tree identical, every space between trees exactly the same, every tree marked with those spiral symbols. After what felt like hours of walking, I realized I was going in circles. I kept coming across the same distinctive rock formation, the same fallen log, the same small clearing. But that was impossible. In a forest where every tree looked identical, how could I recognize specific landmarks? That's when I started to understand that this wasn't a normal forest at all. It was something else, something that only looked like a forest from a distance. As the sun began to set, I decided to make camp where I was. I had no choice. I was lost. My navigation equipment wasn't working, and wandering around in the dark would only make things worse. I found a small clearing and set up my tent, built a fire, and tried to figure out what was happening to me. I went through all the rational explanations I could think of. Maybe I'd gotten turned around and was more lost than I'd realized. Maybe the uniform appearance of the trees was just a coincidence, or some kind of optical illusion caused by the lighting. But deep down, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with this place. As darkness fell, the silence returned. Complete, absolute silence, like the forest was holding its breath. I sat by my fire, trying to stay calm, when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Measured, deliberate footsteps, moving through the trees around my camp. Not the random sounds of animals moving through the forest, but the purposeful stride of something walking upright. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the ring of trees that surrounded my clearing. The footsteps continued, circling my camp at a constant distance, never getting closer, but never moving away. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than the sound had been. I spent the night sitting by my fire, feeding it constantly to keep the flames high. Every time I dozed off, I'd wake to the sound of those footsteps circling my camp. But whenever I shone my light into the trees, there was nothing to see. Dawn brought no relief. The uniform forest stretched in every direction, and my GPS still wasn't working. I packed up my camp and started walking again, choosing a direction at random since all directions looked identical. But now I wasn't alone. I could sense them following me. Not see them, but sense them. Figures moving through the trees, always staying just out of sight, pacing me as I walked. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The worst part was the feeling that they were studying me, like I was some kind of specimen that had wandered into their laboratory, and they were observing my behavior with scientific curiosity. I walked for hours, growing increasingly desperate. The forest never changed, never showed any variation that might indicate I was making progress, and my invisible observers never left me alone. It was late afternoon when I finally saw something different. A building, or what was left of one, standing in a clearing ahead of me. It looked like it had once been a cabin, but it was in ruins now. The roof had collapsed, the walls were crumbling, and vines had grown over most of the structure, but it was the first sign of human presence I'd seen since entering this nightmare forest. I approached the ruins carefully, hoping to find some clue about where I was or how to get out. Inside what had once been the main room, I found the remains of furniture, some old tools, and a stack of papers that had somehow survived the elements. The papers were journal entries, written in a shaky handwriting that suggested the author had been under extreme stress. The dates went back about 10 years, and they told a story that made my situation seem even more hopeless. The journal belonged to a hiker named Michael Torres, who had gotten lost in these same woods in 2009. According to his entries, he'd been trapped here for months, unable to find his way out, slowly going insane from isolation and fear. His final entry was dated 6 months after his first, and it was barely legible. They're not human, I know that now. There's something else, something that's been here much longer than people. They're farming us, collecting us, studying us. I've seen others like me, people who got lost and never found their way home. We're all still here, all still trapped, all still being watched. If someone finds this journal, don't try to help us. Don't try to find us. Just run. Get out while you still can. I dropped the journal and backed away from the ruins. If Michael Torres was right, if people had been getting trapped here for years, then I might never escape either. But I had to try. I left the clearing and continued walking, but now I had a plan. Instead of trying to find my way out of the forest, I was going to try to find its edge. Every artificial environment has boundaries, and if this place had been created by someone or something, there had to be a way in and out. I walked in as straight a line as possible, marking trees as I went to make sure I wasn't going in circles. The sun was setting again when I finally found what I was looking for. The edge of the forest was like a wall. One moment I was walking between the uniform trees with their carved symbols, and the next I was looking at normal, natural woodland. The transition was sharp and absolute, like stepping from one world into another. I didn't hesitate. I crossed that invisible boundary and kept walking, not stopping until I reached a road I recognized. My car was parked about 5 miles away, and I hiked to it in complete darkness, guided only by my flashlight and an overwhelming desire to get as far away from that place as possible. When I finally reached civilization, I tried to report what I'd experienced to the Forest Service, but when I showed them my maps and GPS coordinates, they said there was no record of the area I described. According to their maps, the location where I'd been lost was just normal forest, with no unusual features or restricted areas. I never found any record of Michael Torres or his disappearance. No missing person reports, no search and rescue operations, no trace that he'd ever existed. But I know what I experienced. I know there are places in the mountains that exist outside the normal world, places where something is collecting people who wander too far from the beaten path. I sold all my camping gear the week after I got home. I've never been hiking since, and I never will again. The mountains may be beautiful, but they're not empty. There are things living in the deep places, things that are older and more intelligent than we are. And they're always watching, always waiting for the next lost hiker to stumble into their trap. If you're planning to go backpacking in remote areas, especially in the Appalachian Mountains, be careful. Stick to well-marked trails, travel with others, and always tell someone exactly where you're going and when you plan to return. Because some places in the mountains aren't meant for human visitors, and once you find them, you might discover that leaving isn't as simple as retracing your steps. The forests have their own rules, their own purposes, and their own inhabitants, and they don't always let their visitors go home.